The third question here about housing affordability, I think, gets to the heart of some campaign issues that I'm running on and have talked the most about on the campaign trail. I think that um, the shortage of affordable and accessible housing is really a core and central stressor in so many different, seemingly isolated sort of social issues that unites them all together. I think that the conversation that we're having currently right now in Seattle about housing affordability needs to take into account the links that it has to climate justice, that it has to racial and socioeconomic justice, the links that it has to gender justice. With respect to climate justice, I think it's pretty clear, from the threat of climate change that I spoke of earlier in the IPCC report, saying that we have about a dozen years, if that, to really address climate change as an emergency. We have to be talking about the fact that Seattle is in specific is a city that's right now zoned in such a way that apartments and multifamily housing are essentially illegal in 75% of the city, and the resulting urban sprawl plays directly into the carbon emissions that we see in the air, the smoke that we see throughout the summer, and just a general, I think, unhealthy sorts of lifestyles when you have people that are very, very car dependent as opposed to out exploring the city on foot. With respect to economic justice, I think I was once a rent-burdened student here at the University of Washington and understand what it's like to have to pay 50, 60, some places 70% of my income for rent. And that's just not fair when you have a district that also has the per capita richest neighborhood in the city in Laurelhurst that you have in the same 2 or 3 square mile area. The poorest neighborhood in the city in the University District, the neighborhood that reports the highest rates of poverty. It all speaks to kind of a generational disinheritance at the center of which is housing and the cost that young people have to pay for it. And with respect to gender justice as well, I think that we have to think about the way that our neighborhoods, when you have very little street activity, very few eyes on the street, a lot of constituents that I talk to discuss the feelings of unsafeness that come about as a result. The fact that there are reports of women and LGBTQIA plus folks staying in abusive or otherwise pretty poor relationships because of the financial, the lack of housing options, so they feel tied to bad situations. So we need to build more housing to alleviate all of those sort of issues that seem very siloed but are united under the banner of housing. First thing that we need to do is alleviate our zoning code to make apartments and multifamily housing legal in that 75% of the city where it's currently illegal. We need to have progressive taxation, such like the EHT, which did go down in flames, but I think in part because the political case was not made before the people that depended on it the most, so that there was, some poll that freaked out a lot of people about how unpopular the EHT was, and part of that was because they weren't talking to people like those who I would imagine would form most of the audience for this online forum. A lot of young people, grad students, people who are tied to the university and have a real acute economic stressors in the form of rent. I think the city needs to also be looking at dipping into its its bonding capacity to finance a land bank so that we're sort of able to purchase land as it comes available in the housing market, or as it comes available in the market, and redistribute that land to not-for-profit housing providers. It's an idea that I actually first learned about as a UW student when it was proposed as part of the forward thrust bond initiatives in the late 1960s. And it's not an idea that's grown, any less relevant since then. So those are three solutions that I think of, and I think it has to be, the question of housing has to be tied to the question of progressive revenue and really radical change in how we're using our land and land use decisions, because I think anything other than that, in a lot of ways, is really window dressing, because the bottom line is that in order to build the housing that we need the space to put it on, and we need the revenue for the government to be able to construct it, for not-for-profit housing providers to be able to construct it. And so I think having candidates like me that are willing to name that, what has been a third rail for many candidates in the past is going to be a great asset for us moving forward to build the housing that